Welcome to the training on comprehensive planning for technological emergencies. This training was developed with experts who plan response actions to very toxic chemical agents and radioactive material releases, whether accidental or in a terrorist attack. It is important that emergency planners and first responders, public officials, healthcare workers, and others who work to protect the public understand the unique risks and protective actions associated with these technological hazards. It's also critical, especially in fast-moving and unusual situations, that everyone understands the appropriate response actions and how to communicate that information to affected people. The goals of this training are to ensure that emergency responders have the most current knowledge about response to chemical or radiological events, both accidental or intentional. Using a risk-based response approach, first responders should have knowledge of personal protective equipment, or PPE, and decontamination procedures for each of these agents. To enhance this training, we have incorporated vetted training materials produced for the Federal Emergency Management Agency's, FEMA's, Chemical Stockpile Emergency Preparedness Program, or CSEPP, and the Radiological Emergency Preparedness, or REP, program, and from the fact sheets on radiation, produced by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. In addition, the training includes materials prepared by other scientific institutions, such as the Center for Biosecurity, located in Baltimore, Maryland, and the Department of Energy's DOE National Laboratories, including Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Sandia, Livermore, and Los Alamos. The topics covered in the training on technological hazards include appropriate emergency worker response and PPE, radiation characteristics, including how it is measured, human health effects, signs and symptoms of exposure, and protective actions including the taking of potassium iodide, Ki, after a release of radiological materials from a nuclear power plant or thermonuclear bomb. Chemical agent characteristics, their toxicology, human health effects, signs and symptoms of exposure and contamination, and protective actions for airborne releases of those agents, and issues related to personal and animal decontamination for chemical agents and radiological hazards. The training is divided into modules that reflect the topics. This allows the viewers to pause for discussion, review the previous module, or to take the training in separate increments. While you may likely not face exposure to all, or perhaps any of the scenarios covered in this training video during your career, in the event you are, an understanding of the appropriate response could save your life or that of others. Your response may be to simply help with an evacuation, call for shelter in place, or to help communicate a community response. But whatever it is, doing it safely is paramount. One response event could be the release of, and potential exposure to, a radiological release, as was the case at the fictitious Blue Water nuclear power plant in the state of Columbia, where things took an unexpected turn.
Okay, attention crew update. Let's do the morning brief. This is the Blue Water power plant, Unit 1 pressurized water reactor. We are at 100% power. We've been online for 240 days. RCS boron currently is at 1038 ppm. Pressurizer borons at 1036 ppm. Bravo train is currently in service. Bravo train is also protected train. All major equipment is in operation with the following exceptions today. Nuclear instrument 32 source range detector. We have a bad preamp cable on that. Maintenance is scheduled to replace that cable at 1600 hours today. Alpha boric acid transfer pump is out of service. We have to repair that motor today, and that is scheduled for 0800 hours. OWP ECW-01 Essential Services Chilled Water is in effect. We're keeping a portable ventilation unit in location at the door of the alpha charging pump to make sure that that alpha charging pump remains available throughout the day. Any questions on plant status? Okay. Stacy, let's make sure we have a safe shift today, focus on human error reduction, and let's have a great day. End of brief.
Stacy, we have a loose parts alarm. This could indicate possible mechanical damage to some of the control rods and cladding on some of the fuel rods.
Irene, I understand we have a loose parts alarm.
That is correct.
Irene, I'll call mechanical maintenance and have them respond to the control room for investigation.
Thank you.
Stacy, we have a turbine run back alarm.
Understand, turbine run back.
That's correct.
We've met entry conditions for AOP 10, so we're entering AOP 10 at this time. Crew update. We've got manual reactor trip conditions met. Ty, manually trip the reactor.
Stacy, I'm tripping the reactor.
That's correct, trip the reactor.
Stacy, controls indicate that there is a tube rupture on the #1 steam generator unit, indicating that there's a loss of 650 gallons per minute.
Understand we've got a tube rupture on steam generator 1 of approximately 650 gallons per minute.
That is correct. Also, Stacy, the pressure and water levels in the #1 steam generator are still increasing, and this is indicating that the coolant is flowing into the secondary steam generator.
I understand we have a primary to secondary leak.
2 rods are sticking without full insertion.
Ty, I understand we've got 2 rods stuck out of the core.
I'm injecting additional boron as a neutron absorber to compensate for the lack of shutdown margin.
Understand, Ty, you're adding boron to the core.
That's correct.
Stacy, we appear to have a tube rupture below the water line in the secondary side of the steam generator. However, monitoring systems indicate an intermittent cycling radioactive iodine release, presumably from the #1 main steam valve, relieving pressure buildup from the #1 steam generator.
Irene, I understand we have a radioactive release coming from the #1 steam generator safety valve.
That is correct.
Greg, evaluate the EAL matrix.
Understand, evaluate EAL matrix.
That is correct.
The U.S. nuclear power industry is heavily regulated with a long history of engaging in radiological emergency preparedness. On December 7, 1979, following the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant accident in Pennsylvania, President Carter transferred the federal lead role in off-site radiological emergency planning and preparedness activities from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, to FEMA. In response, FEMA established the Radiological Emergency Preparedness, or REP program, whose mission is to ensure that the health and safety of citizens living around commercial nuclear power plants are adequately protected in the event of a nuclear power plant accident, and to inform and educate the public about radiological emergency preparedness. The REP program responsibilities encompass only off-site activities, that is, the state, tribal, and local government emergency planning and preparedness activities that take place beyond the border of a nuclear power plant. On-site plan activities regarding emergency planning continue to be the responsibility of the NRC. Radiological preparedness requires close and ongoing coordination and communication between FEMA, the NRC, nuclear power plant personnel, and officials from the state, tribal, and local jurisdictions. As a result of the 3 Mile Island accident, FEMA and the NRC collaborated to create New Reg 0654/FEMA Rep 1 Rev 1, which provides major planning standards for state, tribal, and local governments, including development of coordinated emergency plans and agreements, as well as appropriate updates, arrangements for and provisions of emergency support resources, coordination of emergency actions, notification procedures, provision of prompt public warnings or alert and notification procedures for people in the emergency planning zones, emergency communications, public education and information, emergency facilities and equipment, accident assessment including field monitoring procedures, protective actions and response protocols, radiological exposure controls, medical and public health support, recovery and re-entry planning, periodic exercises and drills, and radiological emergency response training procedures and protocols. This document specifies the roles and responsibilities of the plant licensee and that of the state and local governments. Two major issues discussed in the document are the concepts of accident clarification levels and emergency planning zones.
A crew update. Based on plant conditions at time 0929, I am declaring a general emergency based on EAL Foxtrot Golf 1.1, loss of 3 fission product barriers. End of update. Emergency communicator, report to the control room. I say again, emergency communicator, report to the control room.
What you have witnessed is the rapid escalation of the 4 event categories that took us from an unusual event, alert, site area emergency, to a general emergency. An unusual event is signified by a potential degradation of the safety of the plant, but no radioactive materials have been released. An alert means that events are occurring that involve an actual or potential degradation of the plant. Any radiation release is expected to be small. A site area emergency means that events involve processes that could lead to a potential failure of plant functions that are needed for protection of the public. A general emergency is where processes are occurring that involve actual or imminent core degradation with a possible meltdown and loss of containment, and with possible off-site releases of radiation that could be hazardous to nearby residents. Emergency planning zones include the Plume Exposure Pathway Zone, or EPZ, and the Ingestion Pathway Zone, or IPZ, both of which are the result of scientific risk analysis to an accidental release. The EPZ is primarily where human exposure to radiation may occur and extends roughly 10 miles from the plant location. A 50-mile IPZ is where radiation may contaminate the environment, including agricultural products, and could lead to the ingestion of radioactively contaminated items. These also include possible naturally occurring events that could cause a plant accident without warning.
State POC.
This is the Blue Water Power Plant in Bright County. We've declared a general emergency based on current plant operating conditions. Repeat, this is the Blue Water Power Plant in Bright County. We've declared a general emergency based on current plant operating conditions. Our operators have conducted a dose projection assessment and are issuing a Protective Action Recommendation, or PAR. The PAR is to evacuate all residents within 5 miles, 360 degrees around the plant, and 10 miles in downwind sectors Foxtrot, Golf, and Hotel. That's east-southeast, southeast, and south-southeast sectors. And to advise emergency officials in the affected counties to administer potassium iodide to the general public in the evacuated areas in accordance with the state plan.
Okay, I'll put it out.
It's a Blue Water Power Plant out.
Emergency Manager Jameson.
Yeah, James, this is Ed at State. We've got an issue here. This is notification of an emergency to Bright County.
Is this a drill?
And this is not a drill. This is the real thing. We have received word from Blue Water Power Plant. They have issued a general emergency. That's a general emergency due to an accidental release of from their fuel system. We don't have a lot of information right now. But on their recommendation, we are issuing a general evacuation recommendation to people living in a 5-mile radius adjacent to the plant. That's 360 degrees for 5 miles. Also, in the downwind sectors, that's sector F, G, and H, the east-southeast, the southeast, and the south-southeast sectors, for 10 miles, they are to evacuate. We are also advising all emergency personnel and the general public to administer potassium iodide, or the KI pills.
Okay. Hey, listen, is there any chance this thing is going to get any worse, or?
I have very little information right now. I will get more information and pass it on to you as soon as I have it. Okay?
All right, we'll get on this right now. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Attention, all emergency personnel in Bright County. This is the Bright County Emergency Operations Center. We've been notified by the state that a general emergency has been issued because of an incident at the Blue Water Power Plant, and it's to evacuate residents within a 5-mile radius of the plant and for people living within 10 miles of the plant in downwind sectors F, G, and H. That's east, southeast, southeast, and the south-southeast sectors. And to advise the emergency personnel and the general public in the evacuated areas to administer potassium iodide, or KI pills. Activate at the intersections of State Highway 95 and the following roads: Hightower, Lakeshore, and Mills Valley. Notify all off-site emergency workers to don appropriate PPE for the tasks they are performing. We will give you more information as soon as we are updated. Thank you. Okay, we're activating the EOC. I need you to get on this right away. I need you to help her with anything that she needs help with. This right now is serious, but it could get worse. So we need to stay on top of this, all right?
Because of a possible radioactive release, an order has been given to distribute potassium iodide pills and for responders to don appropriate PPE. But to understand what is appropriate PPE, we need to understand something about radiation and follow all local and state procedures. Radiation is simply a term that describes a form of energy that travels through space either as electromagnetic waves or as charged particles. We are all exposed to radiation on a daily basis, but not all radiation is the same. Radioactivity is the spontaneous emission of radiation, either directly from unstable atomic nuclei or as a consequence of a nuclear reaction. Radioactive materials could be released into the environment and affect humans and animals in several ways. There could be an accident at a nuclear power plant, an explosion of an atomic bomb by a rogue nation, an improvised nuclear device, or IND, used by terrorists that would result in a thermonuclear explosion similar to a nuclear bomb, an accidental release from or exposure to a medical or industrial device, or a radiological dispersion device, an RDD, or a dirty bomb, where radioactive materials packaged around a conventional explosive device are released in an explosion and widely dispersed. In addition to power plant accidents or terrorist events, radiological releases can occur at any stage of the nuclear fuel cycle. These include accidents during uranium enrichment, the production of fissionable material, assembly of nuclear weapons, transport of radioactive material, or exposure during spent fuel storage. Additionally, there can be mishaps with medical and industrial uses of radioactive sources or isotopes. Scientists divide radiation into two categories: ionizing and non-ionizing. Non-ionizing radiation, such as visible light, microwaves, lasers, radio waves, and heat, generally is not harmful to humans or the environment when properly used or controlled. Ionizing radiation, on the other hand, has enough energy to actually remove an electron from an atom. This structurally changed atom is called an ion, hence the term ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation occurs naturally from exposure to cosmic rays from the sun and stars, radon gas from Earth's crust, and naturally occurring radioactive particles. or radionuclides, and even from some foods. Ionizing radiation may also be human-produced with exposure coming from medical or industrial diagnostic procedures, coal-fired power plants, even tobacco products, or, in our scenario, an accidental release from a nuclear power reactor. Ionizing radiation is divided into four main types: alpha particles, beta particles, X-rays or gamma rays, and neutrons. Even though ionizing radiation is generally considered dangerous, some forms are much more dangerous than others. Alpha particles, for example, are non-penetrating. They only travel an inch or two in the air and cannot penetrate the skin. If alpha-emitting radioactive particles, radionuclides, are ingested or inhaled, however, they continue to emit energy even after being absorbed into cells and tissue, including bone. Beta particles are slightly more penetrating. They can travel a few yards and in sufficient quantities may cause skin damage. Beta-emitting radionuclides, especially long-lived ones, create internal hazards if ingested or inhaled, and like alpha emitters, can cause significant damage if they are absorbed into body tissues, such as bone, where they may be retained for long periods of time. Some types of radiation, such as X-rays, gamma rays, and neutrons, are highly penetrating and can pass through air, clothing, paper, and even the body. In passing through the body, these forms of radiation may hit cells and produce forms of oxygen that are highly reactive and can be very damaging. Usually the cell can repair itself, but sometimes, especially during cell division in rapidly dividing tissues, the repair may be incorrect or faulty and result in cell death or cancer. Exposure to X-rays, gamma rays, or neutrons during pregnancy may result in abnormalities in the unborn child. There is a common misconception that items or people exposed to radiation become contaminated or radioactive. People receiving X-rays or CT scans do not become radioactive because the radiation passes through the body and there are no particles or radionuclides left on or in the body. Food is irradiated to preserve it, but it does not become radioactive. If, however, radioactive particles land on or are inhaled or ingested, that person actually is contaminated. How radioactive materials act on the body has been a subject of intense study, and the risks and consequences of radiation exposure are well understood. Radiation monitoring has its own vocabulary. Determining how much of a dose a person receives is measured in very specific terms. The risk that a person will suffer health effects from an exposure to radiation is measured using the conventional unit rem. Countries that use metric measures measure exposure by sieverts. 1 sievert equals 100 rem. Because a rem is a rather large quantity, radiation dose is often expressed in units of millirems, or 1,000th of a rem. A chest X-ray is roughly equal to 10 millirem. On average, an individual in the U.S. receives an annual natural background dose of radiation of about 1/3 of a rem, or 300 millirem. Human-made sources, mostly medical procedures, contribute an extra 320 millirem for a non-smoker for a total average annual background radiation dose of 620 millirem. At these doses, scientists can't detect any harmful effects on humans. Some individuals may get higher doses because of their lifestyle, their occupation, or where they live. For example, cigarette smokers receive an additional average annual dose of 1,300 millirem. Flight crews receive an additional 1,000 millirem because of the altitude at which they fly. Nuclear power plant workers receive an additional 560 millirem simply by working near a nuclear source. And medical personnel who work near machines or instruments using radiation receive an extra 70 millirem annually. Just living at a higher altitude, such as in Denver, increases one's annual dose by about 100 millirem due to increased exposure to cosmic rays. How much radiation a person is exposed to is considered the dose. Evacuation of the general public normally will be initiated if projected doses are greater than or equal to 1 rem whole body or 5 rem to the thyroid gland. The EPA recommends that the public be evacuated if doses are projected that are greater than or equal to 5 rem to the whole body or 25 rem or above to the thyroid. Evacuation is the primary protective action for the general public, unless there are circumstances where the evacuation would involve a greater risk than from the radiation exposure, such as might occur during a major winter storm or other disaster that would compromise vehicle safety. In-place sheltering to the general public can be recommended if projected doses are not anticipated to exceed EPA guidelines. Since our first responders are working within an area surrounding the nuclear plant, they would be required to wear a recording dosimeter that would monitor their cumulative exposure. These dosimeters are designed to be sent to designated laboratories for reading and documentation purposes. So, back to our scenario, our first responders have been ordered to don the appropriate PPE. But what is appropriate PPE for this situation? PPE typically consists of a combination of protective clothing and respiratory protective equipment. Let's start with respiratory protection. Two basic types of respirators guard against inhalation of hazardous substances: atmosphere-supplying respirators or air-purifying respirators. Atmosphere-supplying respirators provide air from a source other than the surrounding atmosphere and provide the highest level of respiratory protection. These include the self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBA, and the supplied air respirator. Contained SCBA provides increased maneuverability and more independence than a supplied air respirator. These advantages, however, must be balanced against the increased weight of an SCBA, the limited air supply duration, limited vision if the facepiece fogs, and limited communications capabilities, unless equipped with a microphone. The principal advantage of the supplied air respirator is that it provides an unlimited clean air supply through a hose, although it is necessary to monitor the air supply end and to carefully manage the hose in an effort to avoid mechanical or heat damage. The length of the hose will also limit the distance responders can travel and is therefore restricted to 300 feet. Heat stress, dehydration, and fatigue will limit the time a responder can work in any PPE. There is no standard for setting work times, and individual medical monitoring will be the only means of determining when a worker needs to rest. Air purifying respirators, or APRs, use an air purifying filter or cartridge to remove specific contaminants from ambient air. Some APRs may contain a blower, at which point they are referred to as a powered air purifying respirator, or PAPR, where a motor-powered fan pulls air through filters to make breathing easier. PAPRs come in both tight-fitting and loose-fitting versions. The tight-fitting units require fit testing and an ongoing commitment by the user to remove facial hair. The loose-fitting version does not. In addition to respiratory protective equipment, several types of protective clothing are available depending on the nature of the hazard. The National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, divides these into three general categories: structural firefighting protective clothing, high-temperature protective clothing, and chemical protective clothing, which consists of either liquid splash protective clothing or vapor protective clothing. Because no single protective clothing material or respirator filter can protect the wearer from every hazardous substance, the NFPA has established 4 levels of protective clothing: A, B, C, and D. Level A ensemble should be worn when the highest level of respiratory, skin, eye, and mucous membrane protection is needed. Level A protection consists of chemical-resistant boots with steel toe and shank, coveralls, an SCBA or self-contained breathing apparatus, hard hat, chemical-resistant inner-outer gloves, and a fully encapsulated, vapor-tight, chemical-resistant suit. Level B ensemble should be selected when the highest level of respiratory protection is needed, but a lesser degree of skin and eye protection is required. Level B differs from Level A only in that it provides splash protection through the use of chemical-resistant clothing, which includes overalls and long-sleeve jacket, a 2-piece chemical splash suit, a disposable chemical-resistant coverall, or a fully encapsulated, non-vapor type suit, and SCBA. Level C protection provides the same level of skin protection as Level B, but a lower level of respiratory protection and includes a full face piece, air purifying canister equipped respirator, and chemical resistant clothing. Level C ensembles can be used when the type of airborne substance is known, the concentration can be measured, all the criteria for using air purifying respirators are met, and skin and eye exposures are unlikely. This is the protection recommended for civilian responders in the Chemical Stockpile Emergency Preparedness Program, or CSEPP, who may come in contact with nerve or blister chemical agents. Level C ensembles will require air monitoring and escape routes if the concentration of hazardous materials exceeds the threshold limit. And finally, a Level D ensemble is primarily a normal work uniform with hard hat, gloves, and eye protection. Level D protection provides no respiratory protection and minimal skin protection, and should not be worn on any site where respiratory or skin hazards exist. Structural firefighting clothing, even with an SCBA, provides limited protection against some chemical hazards and is generally considered Level D. NIOSH notes that Level D full-body suits will protect the skin against alpha and beta radiation sources, but the wearer should be aware that unprotected skin and the respiratory tract will still be vulnerable to alpha and beta radiation in Level D if a respirator and face and hand coverings are not worn. None of these suits, nor any other PPE, protect against neutrons or gamma radiation. Neutrons, however, are only released from a reactor, a nuclear bomb, or an improvised nuclear device. Additionally, there are special overgarments that have been designed to provide specialized protection against extreme temperatures. They include an entry suit and a proximity suit. In our scenario, since there has been an actual release of radioactive particles, or radionuclides, some level of protection is necessary. The level of PPE would be established by the state and local jurisdiction following federal guidelines. Since our responders are located outside the evacuation radius, they should not have any exposure, but as a precaution, they have been instructed by the EOC to take potassium iodide pills and wear dosimeters. As alluded to earlier, the thyroid gland is particularly susceptible to absorption of radioactive iodine. In an incident where exposure is expected to exceed 5 rem to the thyroid, potassium iodide, or Ki, is routinely issued to all emergency workers and may be recommended for the public. Ki can be an effective protective measure to reduce the risk of radiation dose to the thyroid if taken just prior to or within the first few hours of exposure to radioactive airborne iodine. Because the protective effect of potassium iodide lasts for only about 24 hours, it must be taken daily until a risk of significant exposure to radioiodine by inhalation or ingestion no longer exists. Potassium iodide is not a substitute for other protective actions, nor is it a protective against any radionuclides other than radioiodines. According to the FDA, Ki is recommended for all responders, but because dosage of Ki varies by age, gender, and other considerations, dosage to the general public will be dictated by public health officials. Remember, Ki only protects the thyroid, not other tissues or organs. Following these simple procedures, our first responders are adequately protected. There are no reliable antidotes once radionuclides are in the body, but some compounds taken under medical supervision can help cleanse the body of specific radioactive materials. If exposure and absorption of radioactive fallout have occurred, medical treatment called chelation may be used to bind the radioactive elements and enhance their flushing out of the body.
Yeah, this is state POC. We have received your declaration of a general emergency at the Blue Water Power Plant. Based on your declaration, we have activated the state and Bright County EOCs and the State Joint Information Center and have recommended to the Bright County officials to initiate off-site protective actions. Now, can you give us some more information about the cause of the declaration?
Yes. At 10:45, the number 1 main steam safety relief valve, designed to relieve pressure buildup in the secondary side of the number 1 steam generator, became lodged in the open position. It's anticipated there will be a monitored, unfiltered airborne release of some radiological materials. We are assuming that 12% of the fuel rods have experienced cladding damage. At 10:46, the number one main steam line radiation monitor reading is increased to 450 millirem per hour. Subsequent dose projections by the Blue Water operators that concurs with the State Department of Health projections indicate that EPA's protective action guidelines have been exceeded outside the Blue Water site boundary.
Obviously, a response that requires the evacuation of a surrounding population is not uniform, but depends on wind direction, terrain, and the amount and type of radiation released. Technological advances have made it possible for federal authorities to immediately monitor the radioactive plume and describe to the public where deposition of radioactive debris may occur and how to avoid those areas. Generally, such information would be immediately broadcast to help people protect themselves. With accurate information, the EOC can determine an appropriate evacuation plan. As real-time variables change, such as wind direction, response actions must be modified to reflect changes. Response could be problematic if private vehicles, public roads, or highways are contaminated.
This is Blue Water Power Plant. Good news. At 12 o'clock, the stuck number one main steam regulator valve was shut by plant damage control team, which means no more steam is coming from the valve and the release is terminated.
Yeah, is everybody there on the line? Okay. This is to be recorded for immediate release. Yeah. This is an EAS message from the Office of Emergency Management for the State of Columbia. At 12:30 p.m., the Blue Water Power Plant announced the valve release problem was fixed and that the Blue Water plant has returned to normal operations. The State Health Department, in conjunction with the State EOC and local emergency officials, will be sending in monitoring teams to assess the situation by measuring the deposition and distribution of the radiation. We will keep the public informed as the monitoring continues, but until the information becomes available, the evacuation order remains in effect. You got that? Okay. Thank you very much.
You can see from this scenario that one of the critical responses to such an event is having consistent and informed communications. Even though the problem at the Blue Water plant has been resolved, there was still a serious release that will require considerable measurements to determine if and where radionuclide deposition has occurred and what decon and remediation is necessary. Until remediation is complete, the evacuation order will likely remain in effect. The possibility of exposure to a radiological release is not confined to a nuclear power facility. A terrorist event could occur anywhere or at any time, and a response appropriate to the event would be necessary.
Yeah, I just finished putting the frosting on our cake. About an hour from now, we're going to be providing quite a party for the good folks in the city. All right, good. Yep, we'll connect up later.
What's the address of your emergency?
Yeah, sure. 2020 Sandy Drive.
What's the emergency you're reporting?
Hey, I heard a loud noise, and there's a car on fire there.
Are you reporting a vehicle fire?
Yeah, I guess so. There's smoke all over the place.
Are there any injuries?
I don't know. There's smoke all over the place, but there's a guy who lives there, but he's kind of a loner.
I'll get the fire department on the way.
All right, yeah, let's do that. Then we'll wrap up a primary search and finish it up.
Looks like we've got bomb making equipment.
Okay, let's go. Everybody back 300 feet. Let's go.
Yeah, dispatch, this is B Company responding to a car fire. Look, we need to request a hazmat and bomb squad backup. We have what looks like maybe a dirty bomb. Yeah, thanks.
As we have seen here, upon putting out the fire, our seasoned first responders recognized something wasn't quite right. The fire seems to have started in the back seat area, and where was the owner? Retreating from the source and calling in hazmat and the bomb squad after seeing the suspicious materials was an appropriate response. Not knowing if there was a bomb or an additional device, standing back for a clearance by the bomb squad protects them from exposure. Working under the assumption that the responding crew was potentially exposed to radiological materials, hazmat would not want to enter that area, a potential hot zone, but would communicate remotely via radio.
So John, what's up? Yeah, well, we responded to what we thought was a routine car fire.
But then it seemed like the fire had started in the back seat instead of the engine compartment back by the gas tank, which is strange. And then when we tried to contact the owner, who I assume lives in that trailer right there, we came across a lot of radioactive labels, boxes, and a pig with powdery substance.
That's when we called you guys in. We have
the bomb squad en route.
Roger that. Let's see what the bomb squad has to say. They're just a few minutes behind me.
You may want to advise your people to put on N95
masks, just to be safe.
Okay, why don't you get those and pass them out? Okay, Captain, what do we have?
Well, John responded to what he thought was just a normal fire call, but they found that the device had gone off in the back seat, whatever it was kind of different than it was a gas tank or an engine. So they, further inspection in the trailer, they found boxes with, what they saw was radioactive materials and stickers and so forth, and a pig with some white substance on it. So anyway, they figured, a dirty bomb or something. So anyway, that's why we called you.
Okay, we'll suit up. We'll go in and check it out.
Great.
Response to a radiological dispersion device, or RDD, sometimes referred to as a dirty bomb, is quite different from a release from a power plant. A dirty bomb is usually some type of explosive or incendiary device in which radioactive material is placed. Upon detonation, the intent is to have the radioactive particles become widely dispersed or carried by smoke to the surrounding area. Since it would typically be a homemade device, the radiological material would be whatever could be found, likely medical or industrial waste. Since most radiological isotopes, including medical and industrial grade products, are made up of very heavy elements, they are unlikely to be carried far from the much lighter products of combustion and would likely precipitate out and be near or on the surface areas around the immediate scene. Even though the area of direct effect would be small, the disruption and psychological effect on the population at large would likely be significant. So excluding unnecessary personnel, media representatives, and converging spectators from the hazard area would be wise. Although a dirty bomb would be a very localized event, there would be a release of dangerous radionuclides that could be deposited on the skin, clothing, structures, and vegetation, or could be inhaled or ingested. Simply moving a short distance upwind from the scene of a dirty bomb could provide significant protection, since dose rate and dose decrease dramatically with distance from the source of the explosion. Normal turnout gear, as we mentioned earlier, provides protection from alpha and beta particles, but provides no protection from X-ray, gamma rays, or neutrons. From our dirty bomb, radionuclides would certainly have been deposited on our first responders' turnout gear. Being protected from any exposure is always the first and best response. In some circumstances, though, responders may have to enter a contaminated area. In that event, the underlying radiation protection principle is to limit their exposure to as low as reasonably achievable, the ALARA principle, to within the whole body limit prescribed for radiation workers, which is at 5 rem total effective dose equivalent per hour. That means that a first responder could safely enter an area of, say, 100 rem, for example, for a 3-minute period. In an emergency situation, these guidelines may not provide the flexibility required for essential operations. In these cases, all possible measures will be taken to limit radiation exposure of emergency workers to an effective dose of 10 rem when protecting valuable property, or up to 25 rem when performing life-saving activities. Doses greater than 25 rem may be allowed for life-saving activities, but only if the emergency workers participate on a voluntary basis and are fully aware of the risks involved. When a person is exposed to radiation, energy is deposited in the tissues of the body. The amount of energy deposited is called the absorbed dose. Absorbed dose is measured using the conventional radiation absorbed dose, or RAD. As we discussed earlier, the term REM is a measurement of radiation exposure that has biological effects. But we use another unit of measurement to indicate the actual amount of radiation absorbed. The idea is that just because one is exposed to radiation, that exposure can be different than the amount of absorbed radiation. Absorbed radiation is measured in rads. 1 rad is generally equal to 1 rem of radiation. But again, exposure to 1 rem doesn't mean absorption of 1 rad radiation. A high radiation absorbed dose greater than 100 rad from a single whole body exposure, usually external, can cause various degrees of radiation sickness or even death. Signs and symptoms may not be seen for days or weeks with a moderate dose. If the exposure is sufficiently great, either from an acute, that is one-time exposure, or low doses over long periods, that is chronic exposure, it can cause cancer, premature aging, or genetic effects that may be passed on to future generations. Severe exposure over an extended period of time can cause death. Radiation sickness signs and symptoms usually begin with loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, fatigue, and diarrhea, and after high doses may progress to anemia, skin burns, dehydration, hair loss, bleeding and bruising, and reduced blood cell counts. The symptoms occur in predictable sequence. The greater the radiation dose, the more rapid the onset of signs and symptoms. Again, the severity of illness depends on the dose rate, and the type and amount of radiation. The effects also depend in part on a person's individual characteristics and whether the person receives whole body exposure, or if not, what areas of the body are exposed. The best indicators of the extent of the radiation sickness are time from exposure to the start of sign and symptoms, the severity of symptoms, and the severity of changes in white blood cells 48 hours after exposure. In a radiation event with a high risk of contamination, such as our dirty bomb, OSHA recommends that respiratory PPE include at a minimum a full face piece air purifying respirator with a P100 or high efficiency particulate air filter, commonly called a HEPA filter. If you need further guidance, refer to OSHA NIOSH Interim Guidance, August 30, 2004. Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, CBRN, Personal Protective Equipment Selection Matrix for Emergency Responders, Radiological Dispersal Device, RDD. In low-risk situations, such as those faced by EMTs or first receivers at medical facilities, or low-risk responder operations, Level D PPE may be adequate. Appropriate respiratory protection will be determined by incident commanders and jurisdictional authorities. Several manufacturers sell radiation protective suits based on European standards. According to OSHA's Technical Manual TED 1-0.15a, these suits protect against alpha and beta particles, but not against penetrating X-ray or gamma radiation or neutrons. They are designed to prevent skin contamination from radioactive particles and should be used with appropriate respirator masks to prevent inhalation and ingestion hazards. Ultimately, the choice of PPE for a radiation event depends on the risk of contamination and exposure and the decision made by the incident commander about what to use. States and local jurisdictions may have more specific regulations regarding PPE for such events. Because of the possibility of adverse health effects in a radiological incident, all emergency workers going into the hot zone must wear and monitor a personal dosimeter. Every emergency worker is personally responsible for, number 1, recording the direct read dosimeter reading every 30 minutes or as otherwise directed according to state, tribal, and local guidelines. 2, reporting the exposure readings to their supervisor every 15 to 30 minutes. 3, reporting to their supervisor when direct read dosimeter readings reach 100 millirem and 500 millirem. And number 4, returning all dosimetry and the radiation exposure record forms to their supervisor at the end of the emergency. Any individual that has received exposure to radiation would also have their exposure documented, and the information would remain on file for 30 years after retirement or as directed. In this scenario, Hazmat would isolate the radiation source and establish perimeter boundaries with hot, warm, and cold zones. The zone boundaries, as well as the evacuation zone, would be established based on dispersion of the radionuclides as determined by wind speed, wind direction, etc. As mentioned earlier, a person contaminated by radioactive materials will continue to be irradiated until the material is removed, either washed off if external or flushed out of the body in urine and feces if internal. Therefore, they and any public in the area would be required to go through decon procedures on site between the warm and cold zones involving, at a minimum, discarding of clothing, lightly brushing exposed skin, and showering prior to seeking immediate medical attention. If preliminary tests indicate the presence of a radiological agent, the FBI will initiate a forensic investigation and secure the area to preserve the scene, control access, confirm the agent type, and determine its specific properties. All FBI hazmat teams have access to an isotope identifier. as do most state RAD response groups, which would greatly enhance the response. The FBI will also search for other types of evidence to establish where the agent was obtained or manufactured and the responsible parties. After securing the site, especially if it may later be considered a crime scene, it's important to set up perimeter control according to the Emergency Planning Guide, or EPG. Establish a chain of command based on the incident command system, gather information, call for additional resources if necessary, relay information to oncoming units, and designate approach routes and staging areas. Incident commanders should also determine what agencies need to be notified regarding the incident. For example, a radiological emergency on a highway requires the U.S. Department of Transportation to be notified, but an on-site emergency at a nuclear power plant requires plant operators to notify the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC. Other individuals or organizations that require notification for an on-site radiological event will vary depending on state guidelines. More information can be found in the National Response Framework, NRF, Nuclear Radiological Incident Annex, and the NRF Terrorism Annex. Emergency preparedness for a thermonuclear device, such as a nuclear bomb or improvised nuclear device, or IND, is quite different than from a fixed-site nuclear power plant accident or an RDD, or dirty bomb incident. With the design of U.S. plants and planned safety upgrades, a power plant can't explode like a nuclear bomb, and off-site releases would likely be minimal, if at all. A dirty bomb also cannot produce a nuclear explosion. The effects of a thermonuclear detonation are usually discussed in two categories. Effects that occur within the first minute are called prompt effects. The initial explosion would produce an intense flash of radiation that includes light and heat waves that move outward in all directions from the source of the explosion, but that would generally dissipate within a few miles of the detonation site. However, the blast wave and fires ignited by the intense heat could devastate structures and seriously affect people to at least a mile from the explosion site, or further, depending on the size of the nuclear device. People up to a mile away who may be outdoors at the time of a nuclear detonation would likely be severely injured or killed by radiation exposure or the blast effects from the pressure wave itself, debris, or fires. People further out, perhaps as much as 10 miles away, who observe the flash of intense light energy are likely to experience a temporary flash blindness lasting for a few seconds to minutes or even longer. The blindness may even be permanent depending on the light intensity. A second category, called delayed effects, is related to fallout from the nuclear detonation and occurs when radioactive particulates generated by the blast and irradiated earth and debris that would be drawn up into the atmosphere by the fireball's heat drop back to Earth. This cloud could rise up to 5 miles into the atmosphere and would typically take the familiar mushroom shape. As the cloud cools, radioactive particulates fall back to the Earth. Where they would be deposited depends on the existing weather conditions, such as wind direction, precipitation, etc. But most would fall on the ground, roofs, or other exposed surfaces. An IND device detonated on or near ground level would produce far more fallout than the same size device detonated high in the air. So seeking immediate shelter from the fallout would be even more imperative in such an event. The bombs used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were detonated at 2,000 feet above the Earth to maximize blast effects, not fallout. Harmful radiation levels from fallout drops rapidly to about half in the first hour and by 80% within the first 24 hours. Even with this decrease, radiation levels near the blast site could be highly dangerous for as much as 2 weeks or more, possibly requiring extended sheltering, especially for those in the plume path. As with any radiological incident, the consequences of each of these threats differ in terms of the doses that individuals would likely experience, the types of radiation sickness symptoms that would result, and the ensuing health effects. The main ways to protect oneself are through time, distance, and shielding. This means people should be told to minimize the duration or time of exposure to the radiation sources, maximize the distance from the source of radiation, and have as much shielding as possible between themselves and the source of radiation. When responding to any radiological event, remember dense materials such as brick, cement, and earth provide better protection than wood, drywall, and thin sheet metal. But the underlying principle will be ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. Technological advances have made it possible for federal authorities to immediately monitor the radioactive plume and describe to the public where deposition of radioactive debris may occur and how to avoid those areas. Generally, such information would be immediately broadcast to help people protect themselves. Radiological contamination can be determined using available radiation detection equipment. Before an incident occurs, local jurisdictions should contact relevant federal partners to help with developing nuclear response plans. Such plans should establish a two-directional flow of mapping and monitoring information. 15 minutes to an hour after a nuclear detonation, for example, the Interagency Modeling and Atmospheric Assessment Center, or IMAC, led by DHS and supported by DOE, is expected to initiate provision of plume and fallout projections to federal, state, and local authorities. This action will help guide local radiation monitoring and to identify at-risk populations. IMAC maps and predictions will be refined as local readings become available. Although unrelated to a radiological release, a chemical release has the potential to create a dangerous situation, dangerous to the public and first responders. The U.S. Army, as part of the Chemical Stockpile Emergency Preparedness Program, CSEPP, has been involved in the protection of civilian communities near the U.S. Army chemical weapons storage facilities.
Gas! George, you okay, George? George! Hey, can you hear me? George!
Whether exposure to this family of chemicals comes from an accidental source or a terrorist event, a proper response must follow.
Johnny, are you okay?
Help! Somebody call 911, help! Help!
Chris, did you see that? Oh, something's not right here. I'm calling airport control.
Yeah,
Excuse me. Yes, this is Sarah Jenkins from the Baggage Assistance Office, requesting help here at Baggage Claim Terminal 1. Yes, I don't know what's going on. We have people keeling down, collapsed into the ground, choking. Right. No. An outside security person came to try to help, but no, they're choking too.
everybody to stand back. Step away, now!
Attention, this is an airport security alert. We have just been informed about an emergency situation at the baggage claim area. We advise everyone in the baggage area to immediately move to an area outside the terminal doors and remain there until further notification. Please do not leave the area or airport at this time, as you may have to be medically evaluated for possible contamination. At this time, we are closing the terminal and putting everyone on standby emergency alert. We repeat, everyone in the baggage claim area should exit the building to the street side and remain there until further notification.
In this scenario, a number of passengers in an airport have unexplainably collapsed in a public area. Based on the reaction of the passengers and the first responders to the event, airport security has deduced that a chemical agent of some type has been released. No mechanical alerting devices are in place to detect chemical or biological agents in the terminal HVAC system, and no threat was received by airport authorities about a possible terrorist attack.
Looks like we got the real thing here, Chief. What can you tell me so far?
Yeah, well, we've got 3 passengers and an officer down in the baggage claim area, and they're showing symptoms of what looks a lot like exposure to toxic gas. Now, I've got a hazmat crew and they got a positive reading on a roller bag, and it's either a organophosphate insecticide or a chemical warfare nerve agent. And either way, I've got medical on the way.
It's unbelievable. Thanks, Chief.
You bet.
Has everyone been notified?
Yes, sir. Our command center is being staffed as we speak. In fact, we're just about ready to begin emergency operations. Can you give a short summary to the staff? I'll tape it so the people outside know what's going on.
Okay, will do. Yes, medical is on the way. 5 minutes tops. Look, don't let anyone, and I mean anyone, near that roller bag. If it is a chemical agent, we need to keep a perimeter around that bag of at least 1,500 feet. Now look, I think we should assume the worst case scenario, and there has been a release of a chemical warfare nerve agent. If that is the case, we need at least 4 people in level A PPE. Now, regular turnout gear will not protect against toxic chemicals. Okay, right. Good, medical's arrived.
Sir, we've got to shut the HVAC down so this does not jeopardize the entire building.
Okay.
Now, this is your head of engineering.
Yeah, that's right.
Go ahead and give him the order to shut the HVAC down.
Okay,
now.
Paul, did you hear that? We've got to get that HVAC shut down as soon as possible. And it probably makes sense to notify the other terminals, put them on alert. We may have to shut down their HVAC as well.
Listen, also, I need air samples. And I heard you say something like you have 4 hazmat guys suited up.
That's
Is that
right.
correct? Okay. Can they give me air samples?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right away.
Okay, we'll take care of it.
Let's go.
Melanie, come on.
So everyone's just finishing getting this in right
Okay,
here.
well, I appreciate you notifying everybody and getting them down here so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was really important.
And then just let me know afterward what else I need
will
to do.
Okay, people, listen up. I think you all remember that exercise we had last fall about the possible chemical release here. Well, we think this is the real deal. Can't tell for sure, but we do know that 3 people and 1 security officer have been overcome by something, probably a gas, contained in a roller bag near baggage claim B about 20 minutes ago. Now, airport security and medical have responded, but we're still waiting for the hazmat and EMT folks to come in from town. At this time, I'm going to have to ask you all to remain in this room until further notice. I'm sorry I can't give you more, but as soon as I learn something, I'll fill you in on what's going on. Thanks for coming so quickly.
Yes, Scott, it's for you.
Scott here? Well, who you have down there now? Okay, good. Make sure the area is clear to at least a 1,500-foot perimeter, and don't let anyone in the area without appropriate level PPE. The FBI forensics people should be down there soon. Listen, we need to notify the state folks. Can you call them for me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, that sounds good. Got it.
It is important that emergency planners and first responders, public officials, healthcare workers, and others who work to protect the public understand the unique risks and protective actions associated with toxic chemicals and chemical warfare agents, whether due to an accidental release or a terrorist attack. Remember, it is critical to have knowledge of appropriate PPE, decontamination procedures, and that everyone understands the appropriate response actions and how to communicate that information to affected people. Like our Dirty Bomb event, if there is a hazardous release, especially if there is a suggestion that a chemical warfare agent is involved, anyone in the area of the release needs to be screened, potentially decontaminated at the site, and receive medical evaluation as soon as possible. In addition to first responders who are at the scene, in this case, airport security personnel, local hazmat and law enforcement agencies, and emergency medical technicians, it is likely regional, state, or federal resources may respond quickly to provide field sampling and analytical capabilities. Such entities include public health agencies, the FBI, National Guard civil support teams, and EPA regional resources. The incident would be classified as a crime scene, and as such, all evidence would be collected and sent to an appropriate laboratory for analysis. The first action for security or law enforcement is to move people away from the general source location to a place where they can be contained and receive appropriate medical attention, including decontamination if necessary. The next task is to stabilize the number of casualties, usually facilitated by an emergency medical unit followed by the separation of exposed individuals from unexposed individuals. In general, those located close to the chemical release will likely exhibit increasingly severe toxic effects. If there's a potential downwind hazard, the next step is to start the process of evacuation or issuing shelter-in-place recommendations. Environmental sampling by hazmat responders trained to technician level is typically done using a handheld ion mobility spectrometer, or IMS, to identify the contaminant promptly and to help locate the release point if it is not already known. Such information is useful to identify the appropriate medical treatment for victims and to establish the hazmat exclusion area, the hot zone, as well as the contamination reduction zone, warm zone, and the support or cold zone. Unless emergency responders quickly identify the chemical threat and don appropriate PPE to provide respiratory and skin protection, some responders may also exhibit agent-specific health effects. Operations level personnel are not allowed in a hot zone but may staff a decon line located in the warm zone. How much harm a chemical agent can cause depends on the unique characteristics of the compound's makeup, how and where it is released, the amount of contamination that occurs, and the length of time a person is exposed. Other conditions that affect the potential degree of harm include the existing environmental conditions at the time of the release, route of exposure, sensitivity of the individual system, and what, if any, protective measures were taken prior to exposure or immediately afterwards, such as when decontamination occurred. Response to a hazmat incident is situation-specific and should be an area of concern when any responder arrives or is dispatched to the incident site. At fixed sites, such as a facility in an industrial park, the type of business and location are good initial clues, as is information provided by managers and owners. Information relayed to a dispatcher may directly or indirectly indicate that hazardous materials are present, as may the signs and symptoms exhibited by victims at the scene or arriving at an emergency room. Visible clues on containers such as markings and labeling, as well as information from witnesses and documentation found at the scene, may confirm the presence of hazardous materials, as may the physical and chemical properties of the released chemical itself. Until the contents are identified, assume that the release is dangerous and airborne, and therefore always follow the hazmat adage, uphill, upstream, and upwind. In this training, we concentrate on health impacts from exposure to nerve, blister, and other chemical warfare or CW agents. We will cover the nerve agents GB and VX, the blister agent sulfur mustard, and the 3 dual-use toxic industrial chemicals, or TICs. Most CW agents are stored as liquids or solids. Exposure to a nerve or blister agent would occur as with other toxic chemicals, through inhalation, direct contact to the skin or eyes, or by ingestion. Injection is highly unlikely. In an accidental event or terrorist scenario, the release mechanism, how the agent gets into the environment, will determine if the agent would remain liquid, become suspended as an aerosol, or be volatilized or evaporated as a toxic vapor. For example, an agent could be placed in a canister, such as a spray can, and vaporized, or it could be spilled as a liquid puddle and evaporate. Blister agents can enter the body more readily through breaks in the skin or if the skin is sunburned. The delivery method would also affect the symptoms exhibited. For example, vapor exposure of a nerve agent to the eyes would have direct effects on vision, while inhaled nerve agent would first affect the nasal passages and after being absorbed through lung tissue would go into the bloodstream and be carried throughout the body. Although the key to determining the potential health effects of CW aerosols or vapors is knowing the amount or concentration of the agent, testing for air concentrations is usually done only with specialized instruments by trained personnel. When swallowed as a contaminated liquid or as a contaminant on food sources, the body can absorb the chemical from the digestive tract. Once absorbed, the chemical may be transported to other parts of the body. Health effects can occur rapidly or be delayed according to the type of agent and dosage. Sulfur mustard blister agents have delayed effects that can occur 2 to 36 hours after exposure, depending on the dose. Since nerve agents are extremely toxic and act quickly on the body, it would be critical to decon and seek immediate medical help. In cases of high exposure to nerve agents, prompt administration of an antidote may be necessary to avert potential life-threatening health effects. Sulfur mustard blister agents can remain stable and potent for very long periods at cold temperatures and in deep water. An example is fishermen who have been contaminated and injured when the liquid sulfur mustard agent leaked onto clothing and deck surfaces after they pulled up corroded containers of old World War I sulfur mustard agent munitions in their nets or dredges. Explosive Ordnance Disposal, or EOD personnel, have experienced similar situations. Sulfur mustard agent usually has an odor like garlic, horseradish, or mustard, different than nerve agents in its effects. Since blisters are estimated to develop after an exposure to a whole body dose of 600 milligrams of sulfur mustard, while the dose that would be lethal to 50% of the exposed adult population is 100 milligrams of liquid on the skin per kilogram of body weight. This would translate to 7 grams, about 1 teaspoon, of liquid agent and the skin of a healthy 155-pound man. Much less would be lethal for infants and children, the elderly, or debilitated individuals. While health effects may be delayed, often the first sign of mustard agent exposure is irritation of the eyes, reddening, itching, tearing, sensitivity to light, or the sensation of having grit in the eye, similar to the signs and symptoms of hay fever. Difficulty breathing occurs only when exposure is severe. Since there is no antidote, immediate decontamination with soap and water, especially of the warm, moist areas of the body, such as underarms and the groin area, is critical. Eyes should be thoroughly flushed with large quantities of plain water. Respiratory support may be needed if exposure was severe, with oxygen administered as needed. Regardless of the time between exposure and subsequent medical treatment, emergency responders and medical staff should be aware that the agent contamination may still be present on the patient's body, hair, or clothing, and take appropriate precautions to protect themselves from secondary contamination. If not decontaminated and sufficient exposure has occurred, the skin may redden and then develop fluid-filled blisters within 12 to 24 hours. In severe exposure, within 4 to 6 hours. If blisters are broken, they can become infected, but the fluid within the blister does not contain sulfur mustard and cannot cause cross-contamination to individuals or clothing. As for any biological fluid, cautions should be taken to prevent contact. If sulfur mustard at sufficient concentration is inhaled, it can injure the lining of the nose, throat, and bronchial tubes. Prolonged exposure can damage the mucous lining of those organs just as blisters damage the outer layer of skin, and is similar to burns caused by exposure to corrosive industrial chemicals. Such tissue injury causes internal inflammation and hemorrhaging and makes airways and lungs susceptible to infection. In severe cases, the resulting airway damage can be fatal. Nerve agents react differently and very quickly on the human body. Nerve agents are odorless, colorless, and tasteless, and therefore more difficult to detect, especially if casualties, human or animal, are not already present. They are chemically similar to organophosphate pesticides, such as the commercial insecticide malathion, but can be up to 1,000 times more potent. The nerve agent VX is considered the most potent. The liquid-to-skin dose estimated to be lethal to 50% of adults exposed would be 5 milligrams of liquid VX on the whole body skin of a 155-pound adult. That's about the same size as a tiny droplet on Lincoln's head of a penny. VX is persistent, unlike GB or sarin. The major signs and symptoms that may indicate a nerve agent exposure has occurred include reduction in pupil size, runny nose, shortness of breath, and headache. With greater exposure, these signs and symptoms may progress to localized sweating, salivation, and muscular twitching, as well as coughing, runny eyes, and lots of foamy secretions and drooling from the mouth. Confusion and inability to follow directions may be present. If the nerve agent were released in high concentrations, there would also be vomiting, diarrhea, loss of muscle and/or respiratory control, and/or consciousness that could quickly lead to death if medical treatment is not received immediately. For nerve agents, there are antidote-filled injections similar to EpiPens, but the antidote must be given very quickly after exposure. Severity of signs and symptoms can also be reduced by removing the victim from the source of exposure and through decontamination. When the source is unknown or unclear, problems with both nerve and blister agent releases are the ability to quickly identify the agent, determine how much was released and where, and assess the resulting contaminated areas, if any. Problems can also arise because instruments often give false positive or false negative results, and sampling tests must be scientifically validated, often in special laboratories located far from the site of the release. As a consequence, this makes it difficult for first responders to identify contaminated areas, employ appropriate decontamination procedures, and determine appropriate PPE. This is true for most chemical warfare agents as well as for toxic industrial chemicals. Toxic industrial chemicals, or TICs, can pose risks during their intended industrial use or if deliberately released by terrorists. The three chemicals considered to pose significant threats are hydrogen cyanide, cyanogen chloride, and phosgene. At ambient temperature and pressure, hydrogen cyanide, HCN, is a colorless gas to pale blue-white or liquid and has a bitter almond odor. Hydrogen cyanide is currently employed in various industrial applications, including fumigation, the production of certain resin monomers, and in liquid form in certain metal mining operations. Cyanogen chloride, CK, is a colorless gas with a highly irritating odor. Cyanogen chloride is used in various industrial processes and was historically deployed as a military chemical warfare agent by several countries. Inhalation is the most common route of exposure, causing major damage to the lungs, although ocular exposure can cause eye injuries and it can be lethal. Phosgene, CG, is a colorless reactive gas. In the United States, phosgene has wide industrial use in the synthesis of other chemicals or products. Phosgene also has a history of military use as a chemical warfare agent during World War I and is described as having an odor resembling new mown hay. Inhalation of phosgene vapor is the primary exposure route for this agent, and lungs are the principal organs that are at risk. Eye, nose, throat, and bronchial irritation can also occur. Many other TICs, such as chlorine, can pose significant hazards to first responders and the public. For protection from a chemical release at a fixed facility, most people will be instructed to evacuate or shelter in place. The proper protective action will be dictated by the situation, which may include, when no fatalities are expected, either protective action is feasible. When people can be evacuated before plume arrival, evacuation is preferable. When conditions make evacuation impossible, sheltering is preferable. When releases are extremely short in duration, sheltering is preferable. When releases are extremely long, evacuation is preferable. And when the people refuse or are unable to take the recommended protective action, the choice may be limited to the alternative. It is prudent to perform those analyses during pre-planning for potential releases. Warning dissemination is also location and hazard specific. In fast-moving events, specialized warning technologies such as tone alert radios or sirens, or route alerting by first responders may be required to get people to take immediate protective actions. In an emergency, initial alert and notification may come from a variety of sources, some official, others not, through various channels. If authorities are sure about the potential threat and where it will occur, the emergency alerting system may be activated to alert and warn those affected. Communication after an event will be essential to inform the public about where to go to determine whether they may be contaminated and need treatment. Without effective prior planning for separate counseling stations and communication, existing medical facilities will likely be overwhelmed by the large numbers of frightened persons or worried well who are desperate to know their status, interfering with the treatment of those who actually need it. This phenomenon of the worried well causing problems has been widely observed. Decontamination for hazmat and chemical warfare agents is defined as the process of reducing or removing hazardous substances by physical means so contaminants are no longer in contact with the body, or by chemical neutralization, called detoxification, so they are no longer hazardous. While the major objective of decontamination of victims is the prevention of further harm and optimization of full clinical recovery, an important additional objective is to avoid secondary contamination of others beyond the exposure site or hot zone. Potential victims of secondary contamination include both first responders and first receivers at healthcare facilities where victims are taken or to which they are self-evacuate. It is generally argued that removal of outer clothing reduces the majority of contaminants, whether chemical or radiological substances. Most field decon efforts involve clothing removal and showering either in a special decon unit, such as a trailer or an expedient setup near the scene of the incident. Bagging and proper disposal of clothing will prevent further spread of contaminants. Field decontamination allows the transfer of clean victims to a healthcare facility without contaminating the conveying vehicle or exposing others such as EMTs en route. It can also be used to decontaminate potentially exposed uninjured persons before they leave the incident scene. In mass decontamination situations with multiple victims, elements readily at hand such as a deluge of water from firefighting hoses may be used. When resources cannot be mobilized quickly enough to perform systematic and assisted decontamination, people potentially exposed to a chemical agent or radioactive particulates should be told to perform self-decontamination and then to assist others in decontaminating. This will likely be feasible for people in residential structure or an institution with showers, but rinsing in a body of water, a muddy ditch, swimming pool, etc. is far better than spending time locating a shower. For people in office buildings, stores, or other commercial locations, this technique may be impractical, as most public places have limited facilities to perform these operations. Victims would need to rely on emergency response crews, use large swimming pools, or relocate to a gym or other recreational facility with multiple showers. Before showering, people should remove and bag all clothing in a plastic bag. Personal items such as cell phones, watches, wallets, and jewelry should be placed in a separate sealable plastic bag inside another sealable bag that people can take with them when leaving the area. Leather items should be bagged and disposed of because they cannot be effectively decontaminated. People should then thoroughly shower with copious amounts of soap and water, followed by a clean water rinse. After drying, people should dress in clean clothes and follow official instructions on taking further protective actions. Clothes stored in drawers and closets should be free of contaminants. To avoid irritating or breaking the skin and forcing the harmful substances into the skin, rubbing or using a stiff bristle brush is not advised for chemical or radiological exposures. An alternative for radioactive fallout is to lightly brush the skin to remove the material. Decontamination is relatively simple for ambulatory victims, but increases in complexity with non-ambulatory victims, people with access and functional needs, and when treating casualties. In some instances, when injuries are life-threatening or victims have been exposed to a highly toxic chemical agent that requires an immediate antidote, medical personnel in appropriate PPE may treat victims before they are decontaminated. While flushing with soapy water solution is the most common method, decontamination should never be delayed if only water is available. Regardless of the process used, decontamination should be performed as quickly as possible after exposure and contamination. Contaminated water used for decon activities should be captured and sequestered, if at all possible, to avoid the further spread of contamination. Animal decontamination is another matter, but should be planned for because of the large number of pets that generally accompany evacuees. A significant number of people will refuse to evacuate without their pets. Owners should not attempt to decon animals unless they are certain they will not be cross-contaminated via contact with residue on the pet's hair or from off-gassing of residual toxic chemicals or their degradation products. Most animals with hair can be deconned using a soap and water solution. Responders performing decon should wear appropriate PPE, be trained to use the PPE, and be trained to handle potentially traumatized animals. It is critical that volunteers lacking training not be allowed to decon animals because of the potential for bites or punctures or harm to the animal itself. Emergency plans should also include decon procedures for search and rescue animals working in or around structures demolished in explosions or fires. Animals will need to be deconned before taking breaks to ensure that debris on their hair and feet will not result in secondary contamination of clean break or relief areas. The underlying goal during the decon process is to protect oneself, others, essential assets, and to the extent possible the environment from further contamination. You can't help others if you become a victim yourself. A coordinated decontamination process that is fast and effective minimizes secondary contamination and maximizes the potential for complete victim recovery. For further information, see the CSEPP video, Operations Level Training, a refresher for responders. The immediate phase of the emergency is over, but follow-up events will continue into the future. Temporary population relocation, further decontamination, recovery, re-entry criteria, and reoccupation are issues with which planners and policymakers must reckon. As part of the incident management team, it is important to make sure the scene isn't released prematurely because gathering evidence may require extensive periods of time. Response officials may monitor media broadcasts and other communication channels such as social media to allow emergency personnel and first responders to correct misinformation, clarify technical information, and prevent erroneous rumors from spreading. Officials often must respond to questions about ambiguous or highly scientific statements given by experts who assume most people understand the science of risk assessment and hazard analysis. It is a public communicator's duty to make sure people understand the elements of the public information message and to make corrections or additions in follow-up messages. It's also important that all corrections be made positively and delivered in a consistent manner. How to monitor response will vary by event. The sources considered most useful include law enforcement and traffic reports, hotlines to 911 centers and dedicated call centers, webcams along interstate highways or critical road intersections, traffic counters, and media coverage and reports. Making sure the message given to various segments of the public are fitting and appropriate is critical to obtaining the desired emergency response. Most people will be unprepared for chemical warfare agent or radiological releases or terrorist events, and warning messages will need to be carefully crafted and vetted to ensure maximum public compliance with recommended response actions. Remember, in an unexpected emergency, people are hungry for any and all information available and will search through various channels and media as long as the event is current. Re-entry and recovery are highly situation specific and occur only after the incident has been stabilized. Appropriate PPE should also be worn until the area is considered safe for re-entry without PPE protection. Remember, the key to successful emergency response for technological hazards is advanced planning and training, prompt decision-making and response, appropriate communication with the public to minimize exposure, taking the necessary steps to prevent secondary contamination, and ensuring successful reoccupation of the affected areas. Comprehensive prior interagency planning and coordination, plus training and regular exercises are critical to achieving these goals. Although there may be some extreme events where persistent chemical agents are widespread or where radioactive materials continue to emit radiation and pose problems, it is possible to protect most citizens and first responders with available tools and appropriate protective measures, plans, and procedures. This concludes the Comprehensive Planning for Technological Emergencies training. We have discussed how to recognize and respond to technological emergencies, both chemical and radiological, using a risk-based response approach, knowledge of appropriate PPE, and decontamination procedures. Although the scenarios are only examples of possible hazardous materials emergencies you may encounter, the knowledge you have gained will assist you in protecting yourself and your community.